Well, 9 months from now, 54 African leaders will be meeting to discuss what has happened since the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which took place on the 25th of May, 1963. So in 2013, it will be 50 years of the anniversary of the Organization of African Unity. And we, 10 Pan-Africanists, have come together to debate what our expectations were and how far the African Union and African states and the African people have gone in terms of advancing a progressive agenda for change on this continent. In the next 3 to 4 months, 54 heads of states will be meeting in Addis. They will do the predictable, which is they will recall the wisdom of Haile Selassie, Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, Robert Sobukwe, Albert Lutuli, all these people. But we may not have 5 or 6 Pan-Africanists in that room who 50 years from now we could be listening to, right? So I think the question for me is, how do we take that conversation into a different space and also begin to energize these conversations that are happening over the next 4 months?
On every indicator that we look, in fact, we might say, yes, we've had some progress over the 50 years in X, Y, and Z ways. We have now, 2 African heads of state who are women. From a gender equity perspective, we can say. But bottom line is, our challengers should judge ourselves not on incremental progress that has been made over 50 years, but we should judge ourselves by what does the African people need us as progressives to actually deliver on. And when we look at it in that perspective, I think the brutal assessment we should come to is that, in fact, the very vision, missions, and so on that drive all of us, we are not meeting it.
We have a common malaise amongst African states, which is lack of responsive governance, which is basically that we have been following the theoretical paper democratic process that what I mean by that is that there is this assumption that if people queue up every 4 months to print a ballot paper and drop it, then that's democracy and that's good governance. It doesn't translate that. We've seen that in Southern Africa, we've seen that in West Africa. But across the board, there has been a move towards increased democratization. The question is, how do we transform that to good responsive governance? And I emphasize on responsive because the common trend is that we have a political elite that is almost neurotic in the pursuit of power and holding on to that power without listening to the grassroots, listening to the electorate. How do we transform the real power of the electorate, the citizens, the power they wield? Because it's that power that placed the elite in positions of political power. How do they firstly recognize, support our citizens to recognize this overwhelming power they have and to channel that strength into holding governments, making our governments accountable? Because I believe that it may not be the magic bullet, but if we get to the point where those who inhabit the corridors of power in Africa think twice about how they append their signature to a global treaty, be it on climate change, if they know that they will come back to account and be called up, like you call people up in the court to explain your deeds, if they have that, not fear, but if they have that strong sense of responsibility, it will definitely translate to better governance.
And what's happened in the meantime, since we won our freedom, is that our assets still continue to be plundered. And Africans remain poor, but if you look at the last few decades, we have fueled a global economy. And still we remain poor. And today, if you look at the situation of Africans, 60 to 70% of the arable land in the world is in Africa. And again, those are subjected to big, huge land grabs as a result of climate crisis and a whole range of factors where developing and developed countries have made choices. So we do not value our assets. And that's the reality, even in our period up to winning our freedom and even today. Today, Africa acts as 54 countries. But if you look at other parts of the world, they act as blocks, political blocks, economic blocks. Why don't we do that? What is missing? And I think it comes back to this question of how organized are we? And then where do we see our destiny?
How is it that our definition is always coming from outside? Our history begins the day of colonization and what happened next. Everything that predated, all governance structures that we had before, or ways of community engagement, or getting voices, whatever, it's just unaccounted for. Everything begins on a very set date, and I find ourselves that we are constantly through the way I look through history for me, and I see activism also, has been in a way that we engage with the process that has been set up, the framework that has been set up for us, instead of challenging it and calling a different narrative and saying, no, we refuse how you've identified us. We go back with our own definition and push that narrative forward. So that has always been a missing aspect for me.
It seems to me that when you look for leadership, and this is the tragedy, perhaps of reflecting on the last 50 years, you find that a lot of the people who actually articulate an agenda that would redeem Africa from a dependency, whether on the north or east, would make Africa self-sufficient, or Africa at least a critical global player, have tended or ended becoming authoritarian in nature. And this is around the question of, is it possible to build consensus within and amongst the citizenry? Are we the only force? Is the state and the political elite in a country the only force that's competing for the opinion of the masses? What role do NGOs play as both self-interested and conduits of an imperial agenda, but also as proper, I think if you're talking about civil society, as proper entities that are not pushing anybody's agenda? We have not problematized this contest around citizenship and its content. We've talked about the procedural questions, where violations exist galore. We have not talked about the material dimensions of citizenship. That the biggest deprivation, at least for those of us in Southern Africa where there was caliber and racism, was not so much that a bunch of white folk called us Kafirs. Was the very fact that after calling us Kafirs, they denied us the ability to economically access opportunities for self-employment and other forms of employment and entrepreneurship. So the politics itself. So the last 50 years for me, I think that was sufficient for reframing dialogue and getting us to see the possibilities of a future.
What came out today is at least a consensus that much of the crisis we're seeing today, whether global development, climate, governance, or etc., are really interlinked. That Africa, even though we've made substantial progress in certain key areas, is still lagging behind in a number of issues as well. And that we need to rethink how we present the problem and how we problematize it from the very beginning, but also how we craft the solutions as we go into the next 50 years. That's really where the question lies now, and we're trying to identify whether we can think of innovative ideas and strategies around two key concrete issues that we've identified now. One being the whole issue around economic governance in Africa. How can we make it inclusive? How can we redefine, reorient Africa's economic model, from the existing extractive oriented economy to a more responsive, development-focused, people-centered development in Africa. That's one big question. And the second is around governance, really. In as much as we claim and we feel that we've made progress in key areas, we're still lagging behind in that regard, in ensuring that we have a responsive and inclusive governance system in Africa. So what are the new types and models of governance we should be pushing forward for the next 50 years is a big question we're debating now. So I would say at least this meeting today, which started with a range of issues from different directions, managed to narrow down and start to debate and reflect on what are the next steps and issues that we can take forward around this.